Do you dolly or do you zoom? Hi, my name is John Cornicello, and today I want to talk about framing and perspective in your photographs. How do you change the size of your subject when framing a photograph? The choices at the time you make the photograph are to change the focal length of the lens, which changes the magnification, and which I will refer to as a zoom, or to move closer or further away from your subject, which I will refer to as a dolly. After making the photo, you can crop and resize to make the subject larger, but for this discussion I want to concentrate on making the photograph. At first it might not seem like a big difference between a zoom move and a dolly. Some people even say that you should zoom with your feet, but I will show you that you cannot zoom with your feet. When you change the focal length without changing the camera position, you are changing the magnification of the scene. If you zoom in, everything in the scene changes magnification the same amount. That is, there is no change of perspective, perspective being defined as the size relationship between objects in the scene. Once you start changing position, moving your feet, the world changes. Your perspective changes. As you move closer to your subject gets larger quickly while other objects behind the subject change at a much less rapid pace, making the depth of the scene appear to be greater. When you move back away from your subject, the background again appears to change a small amount compared to the change in the size of the subject. The scene compresses and flattens out. Some people call this telephoto compression, but it has nothing to do with the lens or the lens focal length. Yes, the scene compressed, but that is because the camera was moved back further away from the subject. When you're using a shorter lens and you move back, everything in the scene gets smaller. To make the subject larger to fill the frame, your usual course of action is to switch to a longer focal length lens, to a telephoto lens. And there is the confusion. Moving the camera back is what compressed the depth of the scene. The telephoto lens was then selected to fill the frame by increasing the magnification. You will see the same compression if you use a wide-angle lens and crop and enlarge the image in post. Think of zooming as cropping in camera. Here are a couple of video clips to illustrate what happens when you zoom versus what happens when you dolly. In the first, the camera remains stationary on a tripod and the lens is zoomed from 24mm to 105mm. Notice that the relationship between the heads and the background remains the same. Everything magnifies the same as the focal length is changed. Next up is a dolly move. The lens remains at 24mm, but the camera is taken off the tripod and is moved closer to the subject. Now notice that the relationship between objects in the scene changes. The backdrop and the two heads remain close to the same size, but the main subject out in front changes drastically. Let's look at the moves side by side. The zoom is on the left and the dolly is on the right. Notice that the relationship between the objects and the shape of the face up front remains the same when zooming. On the right, we see that by moving in closer, the relationship changes and the head has a big change in shape, getting much narrower looking as the camera gets closer to it. Physically moving closer makes the subject stand out more from the background. Reversing the direction shows how moving the camera on the right compresses the scene without changing the focal length of the lens, but at the cost of everything being smaller in the frame, which, as noted earlier, you can compensate for by switching to a longer focal length lens. This doesn't only apply to portraits and people photos. Here is a sailboat out on the Puget Sound. The first image was made at 28mm with the boat being small in the scene. In this situation, I couldn't get physically closer to the sailboat, so I used a longer lens, 105mm, to bring the boat in closer. The boat now takes up more of the frame, but the relationship between the boat and the mountains in the background remains the same, as you can see when the two images are overlaid on each other. So, what about all those websites that say they are showing you a comparison of the effect of various focal length lenses on the look of a face? Most of them are actually showing you what happens when you change the camera to subject distance. They changed two variables for their demonstration. Yes, the focal length has changed, but that was done to keep the subject the same size, as you can see here in these photos of my friend Nye, which were taken with a 24mm lens at different camera to subject distances. Now compare that with this series of images made with different focal length lenses at the same camera to subject distance. If you don't move the camera, the perspective doesn't change. All lenses show the same perspective from the same camera position in the area of the frame that is common between them. My college professor, a crusty Navy man named Ed Scully, drilled this into our heads. Pick the camera subject distance that gives you the perspective that you want, and then select the lens focal length that fills the frame the way you want. And I will close with my favorite Ansel Adams quote, "A good picture is knowing where to stand." Again, my name is John Cornicello, and I thank you for watching. Please keep a lookout for a new longer and more in-depth video about the importance of understanding distance and how it relates to our photography.